Until they said she was too old to cook at 67. Now she runs a bakery. Welcome back and enjoy the story. The autumn chill seeped through the thin walls of Fairview High School's home economics classroom as Frances Mitchell packed 40 years of memories into cardboard boxes, faded recipe cards, well-worn measuring cups, and a collection of handwritten thank-you notes from former students, all carefully placed between layers of tissue paper. The school board's decision had been swift and merciless. Home economics was an outdated program that would be eliminated at the semester's end. Frances, at 67, found herself unexpectedly thrust into early retirement, with little more than a hasty farewell party and a store-bought sheet cake that tasted of artificial vanilla and corporate indifference. "Don't worry about all this old equipment," said Gina, the young nutritional science teacher hired to teach the new culinary arts and modern nutrition course that would replace Frances's curriculum. She gestured dismissively at the vintage stand mixers Frances had lovingly maintained for decades. "The school approved my requisition for all new appliances, state-of-the-art stuff." Frances nodded silently, her throat tight with unspoken protests, as she wrapped her grandmother's rolling pin in an old dish towel. "You know," Gina continued, checking her phone as she spoke, "this is probably for the best. You should relax and leave the cooking to those with fresh ideas. Enjoy your retirement. Take up gardening or something." She flashed a smile that never reached her eyes before turning on her heel, already tapping out a text message as she left. The words cut deeper than any knife in Frances's kitchen. 40 years of passionate teaching reduced to something outdated, something to be discarded, like last week's leftovers. As the final bell rang through the empty classroom, Frances closed the last box and looked around at the space that had been her second home. Generations of students had learned at these counters, not just how to measure flour or proof yeast, but patience, precision, the value of creating something with their own hands. Now it would all be replaced with protein powders, air fryers, and whatever food trends dominated social media that month. With heavy steps, Frances carried the last box to her car, her arthritic fingers protesting against its weight. The drive home felt longer than usual, the familiar streets of Oakwood seemingly stretching endlessly as hot tears blurred her vision. 3 years a widow, and now stripped of her professional identity too. What remained of Frances Mitchell, aside from an empty house and calendar? The morning sun streamed through dusty blinds, casting striped shadows across Frances's kitchen floor. Once the heart of her home, the space had fallen silent in the weeks following her forced retirement. The gleaming copper pots hung untouched. The spice rack, meticulously organized alphabetically, a habit that had amused her late husband David, now gathered a fine layer of dust. Even her beloved KitchenAid mixer, a 30th anniversary gift from David, stood dormant beneath its cover. Frances shuffled to the coffee maker, her slippered feet dragging across the tile. 3 weeks of retirement had already stretched into an eternity. Without the rhythm of school bells and lesson plans, the days blurred together in a haze of television, reruns and half-completed crossword puzzles. Her children called occasionally, James from his architectural firm in Boston, Sarah from her professor's office in Minneapolis, but their lives were full and distant, phone conversations filled with rushed platitudes and promises to visit that rarely materialized. The coffee tasted bitter as Frances stared out the kitchen window at her neglected garden. David had been the one with the green thumb. After his heart attack 3 years ago, the flower beds had slowly surrendered to weeds, much like Frances. Herself was surrendering to the creeping melancholy that followed her from room to room. The telephone's shrill ring cut through the silence. Frances let it ring 4 times before answering. "Frances Mitchell speaking," she said, her teacher's voice automatically falling into place. "Frances, it's Ned." You missed bridge club again. Last night. The concern in her neighbor's voice was evident. That's 3 weeks in a row. Frances sighed, twisting the phone cord around her finger. I'm sorry, Ned. I wasn't feeling well. That's what you said last week. Ned paused, and Frances could picture her oldest friend's worried expression. Neighbors for 35 years, Ned had been her steadfast support after David's death. I'm coming over and I'm bringing cinnamon rolls. The terrible kind from the supermarket that you always complain about. Ned, really? I'll be there in 20 minutes. Put on some real clothes, Frances. The line went dead before she could protest further. Frances looked down at the faded bathrobe she'd been wearing since yesterday. Perhaps Ned was right. Perhaps she needed to at least pretend to be functioning normally. With a resigned sigh, she shuffled toward the bedroom to change, ignoring the growing pile of laundry in the corner. What was the point of ironed clothes when no one saw you anyway? If you are enjoying the story, type 5 in the comments and subscribe for more videos like this. If not, type Zoom. It helps me create even better content for you. Continuing. Frances was just fastening the last button on her cardigan when the doorbell rang. She caught a glimpse of herself in the hallway mirror, pale, with dark circles beneath her eyes, her silver hair limp and unwashed. She hardly recognized the woman staring back at her. "Coming!" she called, her voice sounding strange in the empty house. Ned stood on the porch with a pink bakery box and a determined expression. At 72, her friend remained remarkably spry, her cropped silver hair stylishly cut, her clothes fashionable yet comfortable. Beside her, Frances felt like a faded photograph. "You look terrible," Ned announced, pushing past Frances into the house. "And it smells musty in here. When's the last time you opened a window?" Frances followed her friend into the kitchen, embarrassed by the unwashed coffee cups in the sink. "I've been tired lately, that's all." "You've been depressed," Ned corrected, setting down the bakery box and turning to face Frances. "And I don't blame you. What the school board did was a disgrace. But Frances, you can't just disappear into this house." Frances sank into a kitchen chair, suddenly exhausted by the effort of having a visitor. "What else am I supposed to do, Ned? I'm 67 years old, too old to start over according to the school board, too old to be relevant, too old to have anything to contribute." Ned's expression softened as she put on the kettle for tea. "That's absolute nonsense, and you know it. Your age has nothing to do with your worth or your knowledge." She moved around the kitchen with the familiarity of decades of friendship, opening cabinets to retrieve mugs and tea bags. "This kitchen used to be the happiest place in town. Remember all those Christmas cookie exchanges, the dinner parties, the time you taught our entire bridge club how to make soufflés?" Frances felt a ghost of a smile touch her lips at the memory. The soufflé night had ended in disaster when Harry Johnson had slammed the oven door too hard, collapsing all their delicate creations. They'd ended up eating flattened soufflés and laughing until their sides hurt. "That was a long time ago," Frances said quietly. "Not that long." Ned placed a steaming mug in front of Frances and sat across from her. "You know what's killing me? Walking past your classroom and seeing that pretentious young woman tossing pre-chopped vegetables into an air fryer and calling it cooking. Last week, she was teaching the kids how to make deconstructed apple pie, which as far as I could tell was just apple slices with cinnamon sugar and a packet of store-bought pie crust cut into shapes. Shameful. Despite herself, Frances felt a flare of indignation. Deconstructed apple pie in her classroom. That's not teaching, that's assembling ingredients. Exactly. Ned slapped the table, causing their tea to slosh. Those kids deserve better. They deserve someone who can teach them how food brings people together, how recipes tell our stories. She leaned forward, eyes bright with conviction. They deserve you, Frances, but if the school can't see that, then find another way to share what you know. Frances shook her head, the brief flame of purpose already flickering out. "It's too late, Ned. I'm too..." A sudden crashing sound from somewhere in the house interrupted her. Both women froze. Then Frances stood up quickly. That came from upstairs. They hurried up the stairs, following the sound of running water to the small bathroom adjacent to the spare bedroom. Frances threw open the door to find water gushing from a pipe beneath the sink, already flooding the tiled floor and seeping into the carpet of the connected bedroom. "The shut-off valve!" Frances shouted, dropping to her knees despite her arthritic joints protesting. She reached beneath the cabinet, twisting the rusty valve until the torrent slowed to a drip. "Grab some towels from the linen closet." For the next hour, Frances and Ned worked in synchronized efficiency, sopping up water, moving damaged items to dry, and calling an emergency plumber. It wasn't until the plumber had arrived and identified a corroded pipe as the culprit that Frances realized water had seeped through the bathroom floor and into the kitchen below, directly into the cabinet where she stored her precious recipe book. "My recipes!" Frances gasped, rushing downstairs. To the kitchen, she yanked open the sodden cabinet door and pulled out a leather-bound book, water dripping from its pages. Oh no, no, no. The book, handwritten recipes spanning 4 generations of Mitchell women, had been a wedding gift from her mother. Inside were not just ingredients and instructions, but the history of her family told through food. Her great-grandmother's remedy for chest colds that had saved her children during the influenza epidemic of 1918. Her grandmother's victory garden, vegetable soup that had fed the neighborhood during WO2 rationing, her mother's chocolate cake that had been served at every Mitchell birthday since before Frances was born. As she carefully separated the wet pages, laying them out on every available surface to dry, Frances felt something shift inside her. These weren't just recipes. They were resilience. They were stories of women who had fed their families through depressions and wars, celebrations and sorrows, women who had adapted, persevered, and found purpose in nourishing others. On page 37, partially smeared but still legible, was her grandmother's cinnamon roll recipe. The same rolls that had made her grandparents' small bakery famous throughout 3 counties during the Great Depression. People had traveled miles for those cinnamon rolls, sometimes bartering with fresh eggs or garden vegetables when money was scarce. Frances stared at the recipe, memories flooding back of standing on a stool in her grandmother's kitchen, learning to knead dough until it felt alive under your hands. She could almost smell the cinnamon and sugar, could almost hear her grandmother's voice. Baking is how we show love when words aren't enough. Something inside Frances that had been dormant for weeks, perhaps even years, suddenly flickered to life. She looked up at Ned, who was wringing water from dish towels into the sink. "I need to bake," Frances said, her voice stronger than it had been in weeks. Ned turned, eyebrows raised in surprise at the sudden change in her friend. "Now, with water dripping through your ceiling?" Frances was already rolling up her sleeves, a determined glint in her eye. "Yes, now. I need to make sure this recipe still works. My grandmother's cinnamon rolls." "Well," Ned said slowly, a smile spreading across her face as she recognized the return of the Frances she knew. "I guess we'd better get started then." As the plumber worked upstairs, banging and cursing at the corroded pipes, Frances moved around her kitchen with purpose for the first time since her retirement. She pulled out flour, sugar, and yeast, her movements becoming more confident with each ingredient. By the time the plumber presented her with an exorbitant bill for the emergency service, the kitchen was filled with the comforting scent of cinnamon and freshly baked bread. "Lady, whatever you're making up there smells like heaven," the plumber said, pocketing her check. "Reminds me of my grandmother's kitchen." Frances smiled, the expression feeling foreign on her face after weeks of frowning. "Would you like to try one? They're just cooling now." The plumber hesitated, then nodded eagerly. "If you're offering, I'm not refusing." Minutes later, the burly man sat at her kitchen table, closing his eyes in bliss as he bit into a warm cinnamon roll drizzled with vanilla glaze. "Ma'am, this is the best thing I've eaten in years. My wife would kill for this recipe." Frances felt a warm glow of satisfaction spread through her chest, a feeling she'd almost forgotten. The joy of feeding someone, of seeing pleasure spread across their face as they tasted something made with care and skill. It was why she'd become a home economics teacher all those years ago, why she'd spent decades patiently guiding young hands through their first attempts at cooking. After the plumber left, Frances packed half a dozen cinnamon rolls into a container for him to take home. Ned sat at the table on her third roll and showing no signs of stopping. "These are dangerous," Ned said through a mouthful of pastry. "I'm going to gain 10 pounds if you keep baking these." Frances laughed, actually laughed, for the first time in weeks. "You know, the community centre is having that fundraiser this weekend. The one for the children's library renovation. Maybe I could make a few batches of these to donate." Ned's eyes widened. "A few batches? Frances, you could sell these. People would pay good money for cinnamon rolls that taste like this." Frances shook her head dismissively. "Don't be ridiculous. I'm just a retired home EC teacher. And your grandmother was just a housewife who happened to run the most successful bakery in the county during the worst economic depression in American history." Ned pointed her fork at Frances. "The community center fundraiser needs all the help it can get. Make your rolls and let's see what happens." Beneath the scent of sugar and spice, the smell of purpose was beginning to fill Frances's kitchen once more. Perhaps, she thought as she began to clean up, there was something to Ned's suggestion after all. Little did she know, those cinnamon rolls would change everything. What happens when a simple cinnamon roll recipe reignites a passion buried for decades? As Frances is about to discover, sometimes life's sweetest chapters begin when you least expect them. The community centre hummed with activity as Frances arranged the last of her cinnamon rolls on a borrowed serving platter. She'd been baking since dawn, her kitchen transformed into a production line of rising dough, fragrant filling, and glossy icing. 6 dozen rolls in total, perhaps excessive for a small-town fundraiser, but the process had awakened something in Frances that had been slumbering for too long. "Those look incredible," said Harriet Lopez, the community center director, peering over Frances's shoulder. "And they smell even better. Where shall I put the price sign?" Frances adjusted her glasses nervously. "Price sign? Oh no, these are donated for the fundraiser." Harriet's eyebrows shot up. "All of these? Frances, that's too generous. At least let us charge something. Every dollar helps the children's library." After some negotiation, Frances reluctantly agreed to let Harriet price the rolls at $3 each, though the thought of strangers paying for her baking made her palms sweat. What if they didn't like them? What if her grandmother's recipe didn't translate to modern tastes? As the doors opened and townspeople began filtering in, Frances retreated to a corner, watching anxiously as attendees browsed the various offerings. The local hardware store had donated a new lawnmower for the silent auction. The high school art club displayed greeting cards and pottery. Several tables featured homemade jams, pickles, and baked goods from other community members. "Frances! Frances Mitchell!" A balding man in his 30s approached, his face lighting up with recognition. "It's me, Tommy Garza. I was in your class, let's see, 1999 to 2003. Frances smiled warmly as memory clicked into place. "Tommy, of course I remember you. You were the only boy who voluntarily took all 4 years of my elective courses." Tommy laughed, patting his substantial midsection. "Best decision I ever made, though my waistline might disagree. I heard you're retired now." "That can't be right. The Frances Mitchell I know would never voluntarily leave that classroom." The reminder stung, but Frances maintained her smile. Not voluntarily, no. The school board eliminated the program. Tommy's face darkened. That's just wrong. Your class was the only reason I survived high school. Did you know I'm a pastry chef now? Own a little place over in Riverside. He shook his head in disbelief. I'd never have found my calling if not for you. Before Francis could respond, Tommy was distracted by the display of cinnamon rolls. Hold on, are these yours? He picked one up, examining it with a professional eye before taking a bite. His expression transformed from curiosity to stunned appreciation. Oh my God, Francis, these are exceptional. This lamination in the dough, and is that a hint of cardamom with the cinnamon? Francis felt a blush creep up her neck. My grandmother's recipe. She always said a touch of cardamom was her secret weapon. It's brilliant. Tommy took another bite, closing his eyes in appreciation. You know what? I need like 3 dozen of these. I'm hosting a brunch tomorrow for my in-laws, and these would save me hours of baking. Oh, well, I do have more cooling at home. I'll pay double whatever you're charging here. These are better than what I sell in my shop, and I'm not too proud to admit it. By mid-afternoon, Francis's cinnamon rolls had sold out completely. More surprisingly, she'd accumulated a list of orders for the following week, Tommy's 3 dozen, plus requests from the mayor's wife, the elementary school principal, and a dozen other attendees who had tasted the rolls and immediately wanted more. I told you, Ned whispered triumphantly as they watched Harriet count the proceeds from Francis's table. People know quality when they taste it. Francis felt dizzy with the unexpected turn of events. I can't just start selling baked goods, Ned. I don't have a commercial kitchen or permits or— Mitchell! A sharp voice cut through the crowd. Olivia Chen, editor of the local newspaper and former student of Francis's, approached with a determined stride, notebook in hand. I need to know about these famous cinnamon rolls everyone's talking about. I'm doing a feature on the fundraiser for tomorrow's paper. They're really nothing special, Francis demurred. Just an old family recipe. Nothing special, Olivia raised an eyebrow. The mayor's wife just outbid the bank manager for the last one, and I'm pretty sure I saw our stoic fire chief actually close his eyes in bliss while eating one. That's a story. Despite Francis's protests, Olivia insisted on interviewing her on the spot, scribbling notes as Francis reluctantly shared the history of her grandmother's bakery during the Depression and how the recipe had been passed down through generations. The retired teacher with magic in her rolling pin, Olivia murmured, already composing her headline. I like it. Can I get a photo of you with one of your rolls? Or, wait, they're all gone. She glanced around the empty display. That's even better. Sold out in hours. The readers will eat this up. Pun intended. Francis never expected anything to come of the small newspaper feature. Olivia's article would probably be buried somewhere, between the high school sports scores and the police blotter. Yet somehow, as she drove home with empty containers and a list of orders scribbled on the back of a fundraiser flyer, she felt lighter than she had in months. There was something deeply satisfying about watching people enjoy food she had created, something that filled the void left by her abrupt departure from teaching. Perhaps, she thought, as she pulled into her driveway, there was still some purpose to be found in her grandmother's recipes after all. And Dyson. The newspaper feature ran on the front page of the local section, complete with a photograph of Francis standing proudly beside her empty display tray. Retired teacher revives Depression-era recipe, sells out at community fundraiser, blazed the headline. Beneath it, Olivia had written a surprisingly touching piece about culinary heritage, the importance of passing down traditional techniques and the way food connected generations. By Monday morning, Francis's phone was ringing constantly with orders. By Wednesday, she had converted her home kitchen into a makeshift bakery, with cooling racks balanced precariously on every available surface. By Friday, her arthritic hands ached from kneading dough, but her heart felt fuller than it had in years. "You need a proper space," Ned declared on Saturday morning, helping Frances package the last of the week's orders. "You can't keep using your home kitchen like this. For one thing, it's probably not legal. For another, you'll wear yourself out." Frances sighed, flexing her stiff fingers. "It was fun while it lasted, but you're right. I can't keep this up." It was just nice to feel useful again. The doorbell rang, and Ned went to answer it, while Frances finished tying a gingham ribbon around a box of cinnamon rolls, destined for the hospital administrator's retirement party. "Frances," Ned called from the foyer, "there's someone here to see you." A tall man with salt and pepper hair and fashionable glasses stood beside Ned, looking curiously around Frances's living room. "Miss Mitchell? I'm Patrick Lewis. I read about your cinnamon rolls in the paper and thought I'd come try them for myself, but I see you're quite busy." He gestured to the boxes stacked by the door. "Perhaps we could talk instead." Frances wiped her flour-covered hands on her apron. "I'm afraid I don't have any rolls left to sell today, Mr. Lewis. I'm not here to buy pastries." Patrick smiled, reaching into his jacket pocket and producing a business card. "I'm a real estate investor. I own several properties downtown, including a vacant storefront on Maple Street. I'm looking for a tenant with a unique business concept, and after reading that article, I think you might be exactly what I'm searching for." Frances blinked at him in confusion. "I'm not sure I understand." "Let me be direct," Patrick said, his expression earnest. "Our downtown area has been struggling since the mall opened on the outskirts of town. I've been trying to revitalize the district with local businesses that offer something the chains can't. From what I've heard, your baking is something special, something authentic that people are willing to go out of their way for." He handed Frances his card. "I'm proposing you open a bakery in one of my vacant storefronts. 6-month trial period with reduced rent. If it's successful, we'll negotiate a long-term arrangement." The kitchen fell silent as Frances stared at the business card in her hand. A bakery, her own bakery. The idea was simultaneously thrilling and terrifying. "That's—" she began, then stopped, uncertain how to respond. "Think about it," Patrick said gently. "The space already has some basic kitchen equipment from the previous tenant. It would need work, of course, but it has potential, just like your grandmother's recipe had potential." He nodded toward the newspaper article Frances had proudly displayed on her refrigerator. "Sometimes the old ways are worth preserving." After Patrick left, Frances sat at her kitchen table in stunned silence while Ned paced excitedly around the room. "This is perfect," Ned exclaimed. "It's exactly what you need, Frances, a new beginning, a way to share your talents." Frances shook her head slowly. "It's madness. I'm 67 years old, Ned. I can't start a business at my age." "Why not? Your grandmother ran her bakery well into her 80s, didn't she? That was different. Times were different." "Yes, times were harder then, and she still succeeded." Ned sat down across from Frances, her expression serious. "What's really stopping you? Fear or age?" Before Frances could answer, the phone rang. It was Sarah, her daughter, calling for their weekly check-in. Frances found herself excitedly sharing the day's events, the success of her cinnamon rolls and Patrick's unexpected proposition. Sarah's response was immediate and deflating. "Mom, you can't be serious, opening a business at your age. Do you have any idea how stressful that would be, how physically demanding?" "I'm not decrepit, Sarah," Frances replied, stung by her daughter's dismissive tone. "Of course you're not, but you should be focusing on relaxing hobbies, not starting a high-risk venture that could drain your retirement savings. What would Dad say?" The mention of David sent a pang through Frances's heart. "Your father would say," she began, then paused, truly considering what her supportive, adventurous husband would have advised. Actually, I think he would tell me to go for it. Sarah's sigh was audible through the phone. Mum, please be reasonable. You're too old to start a business. Focus on safe hobbies appropriate for someone your age. Join a book club or something. By the time James called that evening, apparently alerted by his sister, he echoed the same concerns, though with slightly more tact. It's just a big commitment, Mom. Aren't you enjoying your retirement, your freedom? Freedom. Is that what this empty house and emptier days represented? Frances looked around her kitchen, now cluttered with baking supplies and order forms, scribbled on scraps of paper. For the first time in months, she felt alive again, purposeful, connected. Late that night, after Ned had gone home and the house was quiet once more, Frances pulled out her grandmother's recipe book, now carefully restored after the water damage. She ran her fingers over the familiar handwriting, the pages softened from decades of use. "What would you do, Grandma?" she whispered to the empty kitchen. The answer seemed to rise from the pages themselves in her grandmother's practical voice. "You already know what to do, child. Courage is just fear that has said its prayers." The next morning, Frances called Patrick Lewis and accepted his offer. Despite her children's concerns, despite her own anxieties, despite the voice of Gina, the nutrition teacher, echoing in her mind, "Leave the cooking to those with fresh ideas," Frances decided to take a leap of faith into the unknown. She emptied a portion of her modest retirement savings, signed a 6-month lease, and at 67 years old, began a new chapter that no one, least of all herself, had seen coming. Who will support Frances's leap of faith, and who might try to stand in her way? As the vacant storefront begins its transformation, Frances is about to discover that opening a bakery will require more than just her grandmother's recipes. The vacant storefront on Maple Street had once housed a sandwich shop that failed within its first year. Before that, it had been a gift boutique, and before that, a cell phone repair shop. The space seemed cursed with a revolving door of unsuccessful businesses, but as Frances stood in its dusty interior, she didn't see failure. She saw possibility. Sunlight streamed through the large front windows, illuminating floating dust particles and the worn wooden floors. The back area housed a small but serviceable kitchen with a commercial-grade oven, stainless steel countertops, and a walk-in refrigerator that groaned but still functioned. The front space was empty, save for a long counter and a few mismatched shelves left behind by previous tenants. "It needs work," Patrick admitted, as he unlocked the space for Frances's first official visit as its new tenant. "But the bones are good. The building passed its last inspection with flying colors, and the kitchen equipment is older but reliable." Frances walked the perimeter slowly, her mind already rearranging the space. Display cases here, a small seating area there, perhaps some vintage baking implements on the walls as decoration. Despite her children's disapproval, despite her own lingering doubts, excitement bubbled in her chest. "I'll take it," she said, surprising both Patrick and herself with her decisiveness. The next few weeks passed in a whirlwind of activity. Frances redirected all her cinnamon roll orders to "coming soon at our new location" and threw herself into renovating the space. Ned proved invaluable, connecting Frances with reliable local contractors and volunteering her husband Harry to help with painting and minor repairs. "You need a name," Ned declared one afternoon as they scrubbed decades of grime from the front windows. "Something that honors the heritage of your recipes." Frances paused, rag in hand, considering. "Mitchell's Bakery." Ned shook her head. "Too plain. This isn't just any bakery, it's special." After much debate, they settled on Frances's Heritage Bakery, with the tagline, "Recipes handed down, love baked in." Harry, a retired sign painter, volunteered to create the storefront sign and logo, a rolling pin crossed with a wheat stalk, surrounded by the bakery's name in elegant script. As the renovation progressed, Word spread through the small town of Oakwood. Former students stopped by to peek through the windows or offer encouragement. Tommy Garza, true to his word, returned from Riverside several times to advise on equipment and suppliers. Even Olivia from the newspaper dropped in occasionally, documenting the transformation for a follow-up story. Not everyone was supportive. However, Frances's children remained skeptical, their concerns evolving from her age to financial risk. "How much of your savings are you spending on this, Mom?" James asked during one of his increasingly frequent phone calls. "I've been careful," Frances assured him, though the mounting expenses did worry her at night when she lay awake calculating costs versus potential profits. Sarah was more direct. "This is Dad's retirement fund you're burning through. Did you even create a business plan? Have you considered what happens if this fails?" Their doubts planted seeds of anxiety that grew alongside Frances's determination. She found herself working longer hours, pushing through the pain in her arthritic hands, determined to prove that she wasn't making a costly mistake. One particularly exhausting day, as Frances scraped decades-old adhesive from the front windows, she noticed something peculiar beneath the peeling paint on the far wall. Curious, she carefully scraped away more of the paint, revealing colors and shapes beneath. "Ned," she called excitedly, "come look at this." As they carefully removed more of the old paint, a mural began to emerge, a faded but still vibrant painting of a bakery scene from the 1950s. A smiling baker presented a tray of goods to delighted customers, while in the background a small sign read, "Mitchell & Sons Bakery, Esther, 1927. Frances's hand flew to her mouth. "This was my grandparents' bakery, this very building." She stared in disbelief at the revealed mural. "I didn't recognize it because the street has changed so much and the building's been renovated several times. But this is where it all started." Ned squeezed her friend's shoulder. "If that's not a sign, I don't know what is." The discovery of the mural cemented Frances's resolve. This wasn't just a new beginning, it was a continuation. A return to roots she hadn't known were still anchored in this very soil. With renewed determination, she poured her energy into completing the renovations, carefully preserving the mural as the centerpiece of the bakery's design. Finally, after weeks of preparation, Frances's Heritage Bakery was ready for its grand opening. The space had been transformed from a dusty, abandoned storefront into a warm, inviting bakery with vintage charm. The original mural, now carefully restored by a local artist, dominated one wall. Glass display cases gleamed, ready to showcase Frances's creations. Small cafe tables with mismatched chairs salvaged from thrift stores offered seating for a dozen customers. The night before the opening, Frances stayed late, preparing doughs that would need to rise overnight. As she worked in the quiet kitchen, hands moving in the familiar rhythm of kneading and shaping, she felt her grandmother's presence alongside her own. "I hope I'm doing the right thing," she whispered to the empty bakery. "I hope I'm honoring what you built." The grand opening dawned bright and clear, but as Frances unlocked the front door at 7 a.m., her stomach churned with anxiety. What if no one came? What if her cinnamon rolls had just been a novelty that had already run its course? What if Sarah and James were right, and she was too old, too out of touch to succeed in today's business world? For the first hour, the bakery remained empty, except for Ned and Harry, who had arrived early with flowers and moral support. Frances checked the display cases repeatedly, adjusting the perfectly arranged pastries. Besides her famous cinnamon rolls, she had expanded her offerings to include her mother's apple turnovers, her aunt's lemon bars, and her own specialty, honey lavender scones that had won a blue ribbon at the county fair in 1982. At 8:15, the bell above the door finally chimed as Harriet Lopez from the community center entered, followed by two friends. They purchased coffee and scones, complimenting the decor and promising to spread the word. By 9:30, a few more customers had trickled, in mostly friends from bridge club and former colleagues from the high school. By closing time at 2 p.m., Frances had served perhaps 20 customers total, a far cry from the grand opening rush she had secretly hoped for. As she tallied the day's modest receipts, a sense of defeat settled over her. This was just the first day, Ned reassured her, helping to clean up. Word will spread. But the following days brought little improvement. A trickle of curious locals came through, some becoming repeat customers, but nowhere near the volume Frances needed to sustain the business. By the end of the second week, she was struggling to justify staying open. Patrick Lewis stopped by one afternoon, glancing around the nearly empty bakery with poorly concealed disappointment. "The goods are excellent," he said carefully, sampling. "A lavender scone. But perhaps we need to reconsider the concept. Modern consumers want Instagram-worthy treats, colorful macarons, cupcakes with towering frosting, those cookie sandwiches filled with cereal milk cream." Frances frowned. "Those aren't heritage recipes. Those are trends." "Trends sell," Patrick replied simply. "Look, I believe in you, but I also need this venture to succeed. The Downtown Revitalization Committee is watching this project closely. I've got a young consultant who specializes in food marketing. Let me send her over to help you modernize your approach." Before Frances could protest, Patrick had already left, the bell above the door chiming his departure. That evening, as she discarded unsold pastries that were too stale to save, Frances fought back tears of frustration. The bakery wasn't just draining her savings, it was draining her confidence. 3 days later, a young woman with bright blue hair and multiple ear piercings strode into the bakery, bypassing the display cases and extending her hand to Frances. "I'm Zoe Davidson. Patrick sent me to help revamp your menu and marketing." Frances winced at the word revamp, but forced a polite smile. "Nice to meet you, Zoe. Though I'm not sure my recipes need changing." Zoe glanced around the empty bakery, one eyebrow raised skeptically. "With all due respect, Miss Mitchell, the numbers suggest otherwise." She pulled out a tablet and began tapping the screen. "I've analyzed local food trends and social media engagement patterns. Traditional baked goods have a niche market, but to be profitable, you need broader appeal." Over the next few hours, Zoe outlined her vision for modernizing Frances's heritage bakery. Rainbow-colored cinnamon rolls, matcha-infused pastries, gluten-free and vegan options, and something called brookie croissants that Frances couldn't begin to comprehend. "And we'll need to brighten this place up," Zoe added, gesturing to the vintage decor Frances had so carefully chosen. Millennial pink walls, neon signs, maybe a flower wall for Instagram photos. Frances stared at her in horror. "This isn't a nightclub. It's a bakery celebrating family traditions." "Traditions don't pay the bills," Zoe countered bluntly. "Look, I know change is hard, especially at your age, but my age has nothing to do with it," Frances snapped, her patience finally breaking. "I won't compromise on quality or authenticity just to chase trends." Zoe's expression hardened. "Then you'll fail. It's that simple." The tension between them grew over the following days. As Zoe implemented small changes Frances reluctantly permitted: a social media account, bright new signage in the window, promotional flyers distributed around town. But the real conflicts erupted in the kitchen, where Zoe pushed for shortcuts and modern ingredients that Frances adamantly refused. "Pre-made pie fillings would cut your prep time in half," Zoe argued one morning as Frances painstakingly peeled and sliced apples for turnovers. "And taste half as good," Frances retorted. "My customers deserve better." "What customers?" Zoe muttered, just loud enough to be heard. Their heated arguments became legendary among the bakery's few regular patrons, who sometimes lingered over coffee, just to witness the clash between tradition and innovation. Most sided with Frances, but a few whispered that perhaps the young girl has a point. The breaking point came when Frances discovered Zoe experimenting with a pre-packaged cinnamon. Roll dough in the kitchen after hours. This is unacceptable, Frances said, her voice quivering with anger and hurt. These aren't just recipes, they're my family's legacy. Zoe threw down her spatula in frustration. Your legacy is going to bankrupt you if you don't adapt. Why is this so hard for you to understand? Because baking is the only thing I have left, Frances shouted, tears suddenly spilling down her cheeks. Teaching was my life for 40 years, and they took that away. My husband's gone, my children barely call except to criticize, and now you want to take the one thing that still connects me to my grandmother, to my history. The kitchen fell silent except for Frances's quiet sobs. Embarrassed by her outburst, she retreated to the small office in the back of the bakery, closing the door behind her. She sank into her chair, pulling out an old photograph of her grandmother standing proudly in front of the original Mitchell Bakery, the very building Frances now occupied. The circle of history should have felt comforting, but instead it only highlighted her failure to carry on the tradition. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Zoe stood in the doorway, her earlier defiance replaced by uncertainty. "I'm sorry," she said simply. "I didn't realize how personal this was for you." Frances wiped her eyes, embarrassed. "No, I'm sorry. I shouldn't have lost my temper." Zoe stepped into the office, glancing at the photograph in Frances's hands. "Is that your grandmother?" Frances nodded, handing her the faded picture. "Eliza Mitchell. She ran this bakery during the Depression. People said her cinnamon rolls could make you forget your troubles, at least for a little while." Zoe studied the photograph with unexpected reverence. "That's really special, having that kind of family connection." She hesitated, then added, quietly, "I never knew my grandparents. Both sets died before I was born." "I'm sorry to hear that," Frances said, seeing the young woman in a new light. "Everything I know about baking I learned from YouTube videos," Zoe admitted with a self-deprecating laugh. "No family recipes, no traditions, just whatever gets the most views and likes." A silence fell between them, not tense like before, but thoughtful. Frances realized that Zoe's push for modernization wasn't just business strategy. It was the only frame of reference she had. "Would you like to learn how to make the original cinnamon rolls?" Frances offered impulsively. "The way my grandmother Ma taught me." Zoe looked up, surprised. "Really? Even after I've been such a pain?" "Especially because you've been such a pain," Frances replied with a small smile. "You clearly care about making this place successful. We just have different approaches." That evening, after closing, Frances guided Zoe through the process of making her grandmother's famous cinnamon rolls, not the quick version she'd adapted for commercial production, but the original, time-intensive method with its overnight rise and careful lamination of the dough. "The secret isn't just in the ingredients," Frances explained, as she demonstrated the proper kneading technique. "It's in the intention, the patience. My grandmother always said you have to put love into the dough, or it knows and won't rise." "And properly." Zoe snorted skeptically but followed Frances's instructions with surprising dedication. As they worked side by side, Frances found herself sharing stories about her grandmother, her teaching career, and the generations of students she'd introduced to the joy of baking. "So that's why you're so good at explaining things," Zoe observed, as she attempted to roll the dough to Frances's exacting standards. "I wondered why I wasn't more annoyed by your constant corrections." Frances laughed, a genuine warm sound that had been rare in the bakery until now. 40 years of teaching teenagers gives you patience, or you develop it, or you quit. By the time they slid the trays of prepared dough into the refrigerator for their overnight rest, something had shifted between them. Not quite friendship, but a mutual respect born of shared purpose. Your grandmother's recipe is amazing, Zoe admitted as they cleaned up. But honestly, Francis, nobody knows it exists. Your marketing is non-existent, and in today's world, that's fatal for a small business. Instead of bristling at the criticism, Francis considered it. What would you suggest? And please don't say rainbow food coloring. Zoe grinned. Actually, I have another idea. Something that honors your heritage while reaching new customers. She outlined a concept for short videos called Baking Through Time. Episodes where Francis would share the historical significance behind each recipe while demonstrating traditional techniques. People love authenticity and stories, Zoe explained excitedly. Your grandmother's bakery during the Depression, your decades of teaching, that's marketing gold. We film you making these recipes the old-fashioned way, share the history, and put it online. Francis was skeptical, but willing to try. The next morning, they rose early to finish the cinnamon rolls. Zoe set up her phone on a tripod, directing Francis to explain each step as she completed it. At first, Francis was stiff and uncomfortable. On camera, too conscious of her appearance, her age, the liver spots on her hands as she worked the dough. But as she fell into the familiar rhythm of baking, she relaxed, sharing anecdotes about her grandmother serving cinnamon rolls to workers during the railroad strike of 1932, or how the recipe had been adapted during wartime rationing. Okay, now for the final roll. Make sure to keep it tight, Francis instructed, demonstrating with practiced hands. As she reached the end, the dough stuck stubbornly to the counter. After several failed attempts to release it, Francis muttered, a colorful expletive that would have shocked her former students. "Oh, I'm sorry," she gasped, looking mortified at the camera. "You'll edit that out, right?" And Zoe, barely containing her laughter, nodded and continued filming as Francis recovered and finished the roll. Later, as they reviewed the footage, Zoe deliberately left in the unguarded moment. "It's perfect," she insisted when Francis protested. "It shows you're real, not some perfect baking robot. Trust me on this." Against her better judgment, Francis allowed Zoe to post the video on the newly created social media accounts for Francis's Heritage Bakery. By closing time, it had been viewed over 1,000 times, astonishing for their small town. Comments. He poured in, most expressing delight at Francis's authentic reaction to the sticky dough. "The cursing baker grandma is my new favorite thing," read one comment. "Can we please get this woman her own show? I'd watch her bake and swear all day," said another. By the following morning, the video had somehow reached well beyond Oakwood, with tens of thousands of views and hundreds of comments asking where to find the bakery and if Francis shipped her cinnamon rolls. Orders began coming in, not just from locals, but from neighboring towns and cities up to 50 miles away. A local delivery service called, offering to partner with the bakery to fulfill orders within a 30-mile radius. A regional morning show contacted Zoe about featuring the cursing baker grandma in a segment. The bakery's phone rang constantly, and for the first time since opening, Francis sold out of everything before noon. "I can't keep up with this," Francis admitted to Zoe as they furiously baked late into the night to prepare for the next day. "My hands can't handle this much kneading anymore." Zoe, now fully invested in the bakery's success, suggested hiring help. "We need at least one more baker, maybe two, and someone for the front counter. This is good, Francis. This is what success looks like." Francis was about to agree when a sharp pain shot through her right hand as she attempted to roll out dough for the next day's turnovers. She gasped, dropping the rolling pin, which clattered loudly on the floor. "What's wrong?" Zoe asked, rushing over. "Arthritis," Francis admitted, massaging her swollen joints. "It comes and goes, but with all this extra work." Zoe helped her to a chair, concern evident in her expression. "Why didn't you say something?" We've been baking non-stop for days. Frances shook her head. I didn't want to seem old. Zoe raised an eyebrow. Frances, you're 67, not dead. It's okay to have limitations. We'll work around them. The arthritis flare-up continued for days, rendering Frances unable to perform the physical aspects of baking. She could still mix ingredients and direct operations, but the crucial tasks of kneading, rolling, and shaping dough became impossible. Zoe did her best to fill the gap, following Frances's instructions meticulously, but she lacked the decades of experience that guided Frances's hands. When an important order came in for the mayor's anniversary celebration, 5 dozen assorted pastries, including the now famous cinnamon rolls, Zoe began to panic. I can't do this alone, she admitted to Frances, who sat at a small desk in the kitchen, her hands wrapped in heating pads. Not to your standards, not in time. Frances stared at the order form, feeling defeat looming once again. Just as they'd found success, her own body was betraying her. Zoe's next words caught her completely off guard. I think we should call your daughter. Frances looked up sharply. Sarah? Why? You've shown me pictures of her baking with you. When she was younger, you said she was a natural. Maybe she could help, just for this order. The thought of calling Sarah, of admitting she needed help with the very business her daughter had warned against starting, made Frances's stomach clench. But the mayor's order couldn't be delayed, and the bakery's reputation was at stake. With great reluctance, Frances dialed her daughter's number that evening. Sarah Mitchell, came the crisp, professional answer. Sarah, it's Mom. A pause, then concern. Mom, is everything okay? It's late for you to be calling. Frances swallowed her pride. I need your help, sweetheart. Just for the weekend. Uja, have you ever known someone who had to start over unexpectedly late in life? How did they manage the transition? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Sarah arrived Friday evening, her corporate efficiency evident in her precisely a packed weekend bag and the skeptical assessment she gave the bakery as Frances gave her a tour. So this is where all your retirement savings went, she said, running a finger along a countertop. It's quaint. Frances bit back a defensive response. We've been doing quite well, actually, until my arthritis flared up. Sarah's expression softened slightly at the mention of her mother's condition. Let me see your hands. Frances reluctantly extended her swollen fingers. Sarah frowned, gently turning her mother's hands over to examine the inflamed joints. Have you seen a doctor? There are better treatments now than just heating pads and over-the-counter pain relievers. I've been too busy, Frances admitted. Sarah sighed. The corporate executive momentarily replaced by a concerned daughter. That's exactly what worried me about this venture. You're pushing yourself too hard at an age when you should be relaxing. I was relaxing myself into depression before this bakery, Frances replied, with unexpected candor. But we can discuss my life choices after we fulfill the mayor's order. Zoe's already prepped the ingredients. As if summoned, Zoe emerged. From the back kitchen, flour dusting her blue hair and smudged across one cheek. You must be Sarah. Thank God you're here. We're seriously behind schedule. Sarah's eyebrows rose at Zoe's appearance, but she simply nodded, rolling up the sleeves of her expensive blouse. Show me what needs to be done. For the next several hours, the bakery hummed with activity as Sarah slipped back into the rhythms of baking she'd learned at her mother's side decades earlier. Frances sat at the small desk, directing operations, while Zoe and Sarah executed her instructions. To Frances's surprise, the two younger women worked well together, their different backgrounds and perspectives somehow complementing each other. Your mom's a genius with flavor profiles, Zoe told Sarah as they rolled dough for the cinnamon rolls. I've been trying to convince her to update the bakery's offerings, but now I'm beginning to appreciate the classics. Sarah nodded thoughtfully. She taught home EC for 40 years. Did you know she was nominated for Teacher of the Year 5 times? Won it twice. I didn't, Zoe replied, glancing at Frances with new respect. She doesn't talk much about her teaching career. The school board ended the program, Frances explained, feeling the familiar sting of rejection. Said it was outdated. Sarah paused in her rolling. You never told me that's why you retired. I thought it was your choice. It wasn't, Frances said simply. Just like David's heart attack wasn't his choice. You adapt to what life gives you. A thoughtful silence fell over the kitchen, broken only by the rhythmic sound of rolling pins on dough and the occasional direction from Frances. By dawn, they had completed most of the mayor's order, the pastries cooling on racks throughout the kitchen. Despite the exhaustion, there was a sense of accomplishment in the air, and something else, a connection between the three women that transcended their differences. As they sipped coffee in the pre-dawn quiet, Sarah studied her mother with new eyes. This place really matters to you, doesn't it? Frances nodded. It's given me purpose again, and it's connected me to a history I'd almost forgotten. She gestured to the old photograph of her grandmother's bakery that now hung framed beside the restored mural. This building has been in our family's story for generations. I'm just continuing the tradition. Sarah was silent for a long moment, then said, I've been offered a sabbatical from the firm. 3 months, possibly extendable. I've been putting off making a decision. Frances looked up sharply. A sabbatical? Why? Sarah's professional composure slipped, revealing the exhaustion beneath. Burnout, they call it. 15 years of 70-hour. Weeks, constant travel, endless corporate politics. I'm tired, Mom. Soul tired. For the first time, Frances noticed the dark circles under her daughter's eyes, the tension in her shoulders, the way her smile seemed forced. How had she missed the signs? Perhaps because Sarah had always been the strong one, the achiever, the child who never seemed to need help. Stay, Frances said impulsively. Not just the weekend. Take the sabbatical. Help me with the bakery until we can train someone permanent. Sarah laughed, but it wasn't entirely dismissive. From corporate executive to bakery assistant? That would be quite the career shift. More like bakery manager, Zoe interjected. Frances needs someone to handle the business side, accounting, vendor relationships, staff management. The bakery's growing too fast for us to keep up. The bell above the front door chimed, signaling the arrival of the bakery's first Saturday customers. Zoe hurried to the front, leaving mother and daughter alone in the kitchen. I can't make decisions based on a crisis, Sarah said, but her tone was thoughtful rather than rejecting. Let me get through this weekend, help you fulfill the mayor's order, and then we'll talk. It was more than Frances had hoped for. As they worked side by side throughout the day, she saw glimpses of the daughter she remembered from years ago, before corporate ambition and geographic distance had created a gulf between them. Sarah's perfectionist attention to detail, her quick mind, her unexpected creativity when a batch of lemon curd separated and needed to be salvaged, all qualities that had once been nurtured in Frances's own kitchen. The mayor's anniversary celebration was a resounding success, with the pastries, particularly Frances's cinnamon rolls, drawing effusive compliments from attendees. Orders continued to pour in, and the bakery's social media following grew exponentially. After Zoe posted a behind-the-scenes video of their baking marathon, hashtagged Much 3 Generations of Bakers. I'm not actually a baker, Sarah pointed out when Zoe showed her the viral post. You're Frances's daughter, working in her bakery, using her mother's recipes, Zoe replied pragmatically. Close enough for social media. Sunday evening, as they cleaned the kitchen after another successful day, Sarah made an announcement that stunned both Frances and Zoe. I'm taking the sabbatical. 3 months, starting as soon as I can tie up loose ends at work. She held upper hand to forestall Francis's excited response. "But I have conditions. First, we need to put this business on a proper financial footing. Accounting software, business plan, marketing budget, the works. Second, we hire help immediately. You can't keep working yourself into exhaustion, Mom. And third, we explore expanding beyond just pastries." Francis blinked in surprise. "Expanding? How?" "Zoe mentioned you were thinking about offering baking classes," Sarah continued. "I think that's brilliant. This town lost its only home economics program when you were forced out of the high school. There's an educational void we could fill. Classes for all ages, kids, adults, seniors. We could even develop specialized workshops for people with dietary restrictions." The idea had been percolating in Zoe's mind for weeks, but hearing it from Sarah, with her corporate polish and strategic thinking, made it suddenly seem not just possible, but inevitable. "The classroom could be right here," Zoe said excitedly, gesturing to the underutilized front section of the bakery. "We rearranged the seating area, add a demonstration counter facing outward instead of toward the wall. Install a mirror above so students can see what you're doing from above." As Zoe and Sarah enthusiastically sketched out plans for the classroom expansion, Francis sat quietly, watching the two younger women with a mixture of amazement and gratitude. Somehow, this bakery that had begun as a desperate grasp at purpose had become something more, a bridge between generations, a second chance not just for her, but perhaps for her daughter too. The 6-month trial period with Patrick Lewis was nearing its end, and Francis knew he would soon return, expecting either to terminate the lease or to drastically raise the rent now that the bakery had found success. That worry could wait for tomorrow, she decided. Tonight, watching Sarah and Zoe debate the merits of various scheduling software for the proposed classes, Francis allowed herself to simply enjoy the moment and to marvel at how life could surprise you, even at 67. The weeks that followed Sarah's decision transformed Francis's heritage bakery in ways Francis could never have imagined. Sarah's corporate efficiency streamlined the bakery's operations, implementing proper inventory systems, financial tracking, and staff scheduling. Under her management, they hired 2 part-time bakers and a counterperson, relieving Francis and Zoe of the most physically demanding aspects of the daily production. Francis found herself in a new role, mentor and teacher once again, but now to a multi-generational team that included retirees seeking part-time work and culinary students gaining practical experience. Her arthritis improved with a proper treatment plan from the specialist Sarah had insisted she see, allowing her to demonstrate techniques and perfect recipes without the punishing physical toll of daily production baking. Zoe continued to manage the bakery's growing social media presence, turning the cursing baker grandma into a beloved online personality. Francis initially resisted this characterization, but gradually embraced it as she saw how it connected her with people far beyond Oakwood's boundaries. The occasional mild expletive that slipped out when a dough wouldn't cooperate or a meringue collapsed became almost expected, each one greeted with delight by her online followers. The classroom expansion proved to be Sarah's most inspired contribution. What began as weekend workshops quickly expanded into a full schedule of classes for all age groups, from tiny bakers' sessions for preschoolers to baking fundamentals, for adults to heritage skills, for seniors wanting to preserve and share family recipes. Francis found herself teaching again, this time without the constraints of standardized curricula or school board approval. "You've built something remarkable here," Ned told Francis one afternoon, as they watched a classroom full of teenagers learn to make puff pastry from scratch, the same teenagers who would have taken Francis's home economics course had it not been eliminated. "And not just a successful business, you're preserving knowledge that might otherwise be lost." Francis nodded, watching with pride as one particularly focused young man achieved the perfect lamination on his first try. "I'm just passing on what my grandmother taught me." "That's how culture survives," Ned replied, "one person caring enough to teach another." The bakery had become more than a business. It was becoming a community hub, a place where food connected people across generations and backgrounds. Local farmers began supplying the bakery with seasonal produce. A nearby dairy offered to provide cream from grass-fed cows at a reduced rate in exchange for France's teaching cheese-making workshops using their products. The high school's new guidance counselor approached Sarah about establishing an internship program for students interested in culinary careers. Even James, Francis's son, who had been skeptical of the entire venture, flew in from Boston for a long weekend to see what his mother and sister had created. Francis watched nervously as he toured the bakery, his architect's eye assessing the space and its potential. "What do you think?" she finally asked as he examined the plans for the expanded classroom area. James considered for a moment. "I think you're going to need more space soon. The classroom is a good start, but if you're serious about growing the educational component, you'll want dedicated facilities." It wasn't the criticism Francis had feared, but rather professional assessment, one expert to another. She realized with a start that James was taking the bakery seriously as a business venture, not just humoring his mother's retirement project. "The building next door has been vacant for almost a year," James continued, warming to the subject. "If you could acquire it and connect the spaces, you'd have room for both retail and educational expansion." Sarah, who had been listening nearby, exchanged a meaningful look with Francis. "Actually," she said carefully, "we've already been in and talks about that property." "You have?" Francis asked, surprised. Sarah had been managing the business side, but this was the first she'd heard of expansion plans. Sarah nodded. "I've been researching the possibility. The Downtown Revitalization Committee is interested in supporting businesses that bring foot traffic to the area. There might be grants available, especially for the educational component." That evening, over dinner at Francis's house, Sarah revealed the full extent of her plans. She had not only been researching the neighboring property, but had also been quietly purchasing small amounts of stock in Patrick Lewis's real estate company. Not enough to control anything, but enough to get information about his future plans. For the downtown area, he's planning to raise your rent significantly when the trial period ends next month, Sarah explained, and he's been in talks with a chain bakery about opening across the street. Francis felt a chill of fear. "A chain bakery? We couldn't compete with their prices." No, but they can't compete with your authenticity or your educational programs," Sarah pointed out. "Still, it would hurt business, which is why I've been developing alternatives." James leaned forward, intrigued by his sister's strategy. "What kind of alternatives?" Sarah smiled, the same confident smile she'd used to close major corporate deals. "Either Patrick becomes a true partner in our growing enterprise, or we offer to buy this building from him outright. We'd be better positioned if we owned the property instead of leasing." "Buy the building," Francis repeated, alarmed. "Sarah, that's far beyond what we can afford." Not necessarily," James interjected, his expression thoughtful. "Commercial property in this area isn't as expensive as you might think, especially buildings that have stood vacant for extended periods. And with the bakery's growing revenue, bank financing might be possible." Frances looked back and forth between her children, amazed at how fully they had embraced this venture that they had once discouraged. "When did you two become so invested in my little bakery?" Sarah's professional demeanor softened. "When I saw what it really was, not just a retirement hobby, but a viable business with real value to the community. And," she added more quietly, When I saw how happy it makes you, Mom. Indeed, a week before the 6-month trial period was set to expire, Patrick Lewis arrived at the bakery during the morning rush. Francis, in the midst of teaching a group of homeschooled children how to make simple breakfast pastries, barely noticed his entrance. Sarah, however, spotted him immediately and approached with a professional smile. "Mr. Lewis, what a pleasure. Would you like to try our new morning bun? It's a variation on our cinnamon roll, but with orange zest and cardamom." Patrick accepted the offered pastry, his eyes taking in the bustling bakery, the full tables, the line at the counter, the engaged students in Francis's class. "Impressive," he acknowledged. "Very different from my last visit." "Yes, we've made some adjustments," Sarah replied smoothly. "Perhaps we could discuss the lease renewal in our office. My mother is teaching at the moment." Francis watched from the corner of her eye as Sarah led Patrick to the small room they'd converted to an office, closing the door behind them. Despite her confidence in her daughter's business acumen, anxiety knotted in her stomach. Everything they'd built could be jeopardized if Patrick raised the rent too high or decided to court the chain bakery instead. Nearly an hour passed before the office door opened again. Sarah emerged first, her expression carefully neutral, followed by Patrick, who looked somewhat dazed. They shook hands formally before Patrick departed, nodding briefly to Francis as he left. The children's class ended shortly thereafter, with proud students carrying home bags of freshly baked pastries. As the last child departed, Francis turned to Sarah anxiously. "What happened? What did he say?" Sarah's professional composure cracked into a wide grin. "He accepted our offer." "Which offer?" Francis asked, confused. "The second one. He's not selling the building, at least not yet, but he's agreed to a 5-year lease with fixed rent increases and first right of refusal if he decides to sell." And, Sarah added with evident satisfaction, "he's terminated negotiations with the chain bakery." Relief washed over Francis, followed quickly by curiosity. "What did you say to change his mind?" Sarah smiled enigmatically. "Let's just say I made a business case he couldn't refuse, and I might have mentioned that our family has some experience with property development." She glanced meaningfully at the restored mural of the original Mitchell Bakery. "This building has been part of our family's story for nearly a century. I simply helped him understand that we're committed to its future for at least another century. More, exactly 1 year from the day Francis had been forced into retirement, Francis's Heritage Bakery held a grand reopening celebration to unveil its expanded space. The neighboring building had indeed become available, and with a combination of bank financing, a small business grant, and an investment from James, who had surprised everyone by offering to become a silent partner, they had acquired and renovated it to house an expanded teaching kitchen and community event space. The mayor, who had become one of their most loyal customers, cut the ribbon on the new facility. Local news covered the event, with Olivia Chen writing a feature that contrasted Francis's unceremonious dismissal from teaching with her triumphant return as a business owner and educator. Former students from throughout Francis's 40-year teaching career attended, many bringing their own children or grandchildren to meet the teacher who taught me everything I know about cooking. Tommy Garza, the pastry chef from Riverside, catered the event with an elaborate cake modeled after the original Mitchell Bakery. "Full circle," he told Francis as they admired his creation. "You taught me to bake, and now I'm baking for you." Even Gina, the nutritional science teacher who had replaced Francis at Fairview High, made an appearance, somewhat sheepishly admitting that she had recently incorporated some of Francis's traditional techniques into her curriculum. The students kept asking why their results didn't taste as good as what they made at your bakery, she explained. "Sometimes the old ways really are best." As the celebration wound down, Frances found a quiet moment alone in the new teaching kitchen. The space was beautiful. State-of-the-art equipment, alongside vintage tools, workspace for 20 students, and a demonstration area specially designed to accommodate her height and physical needs as she aged. Above the instructor's counter hung a beautifully framed collection of handwritten recipe cards, her grandmother's, her mother's, and her own, preserved behind glass but visible as inspiration. "What do you think?" Sarah asked, joining her mother. "Worth coming out of retirement for?" Frances smiled, running her hand along the smooth countertop. "Absolutely, though I'm not sure I was ever really retired, just momentarily redirected." Sarah laughed. "That's one way to look at it." She hesitated, then added, "My sabbatical ends next month." Frances nodded, trying to hide her disappointment. She'd grown accustomed to having Sarah nearby, to working together, to rebuilding their relationship through this shared endeavor. "You'll be heading back to Minneapolis then?" "Actually," Sarah said slowly, "I've been offered a transfer to the regional office here in Oakwood. It's a step down in terms of prestige, but," she gestured around the bakery, "I've discovered I like building something real more than I like corporate politics, and the bakery needs a proper business manager if we're going to continue growing." Before Frances could respond, the door to the teaching kitchen swung open to admit James, who had extended his visit to attend the reopening. "There you are. Your grandson is looking for you, Mum." Behind James came a tall young man with David's eyes and Frances's determined chin, Sarah's son Michael, now in his final year of culinary school. He had visited briefly during spring break, initially dismissive of his grandmother's amateur baking operation, but had been humbled by her expertise and the bakery's success. "Grandma," Michael said, crossing the kitchen to embrace Frances, "the new space is amazing. I was wondering if the offer still stands about that summer apprenticeship?" Frances hugged him tightly, emotions threatening to overwhelm her. "Of course it stands. We'll put you to work the day after graduation." As the four of them stood together in the teaching kitchen, Frances, her daughter, her son, and her grandson, Frances felt a sense of completion that had nothing to do with ribbon cuttings or news coverage or business success. The bakery had become more than a second act in her life. It had become a bridge between past and future, connecting generations through the simple, profound act of creating food with love and intention. "You know," James said thoughtfully, examining the framed recipe cards, "Dad would have loved this place. Remember how he used to say, 'Mom's kitchen was the heart of our home'?" Sarah nodded, a soft smile playing on her lips. "I think that's what we've created here. A new heart for our family, and for the community." As the sun began to set, casting golden light through the bakery's windows, Frances looked around at what they had built together. The empty storefront that had once seemed like a desperate last grasp at purpose had transformed into something beyond her wildest dreams, a thriving business, an educational center, a gathering place for the community, and most importantly, a legacy that would continue beyond her years. "I was thinking," Michael said hesitantly, "about the name. Frances's Heritage Bakery is great, but what about something that reflects the whole family? Maybe Mitchell Family Bakery, or Mitchell's Esther 1927. Frances considered this, touched by her grandson's desire to connect with the family legacy. "I think your great-great-grandmother would approve of that. After all, she's the one who started it all." As they left the kitchen together, Frances paused to look once more at the framed recipe cards on the wall, the tangible evidence of generations of Mitchell women who had found purpose and identity in creating food with love. When the school board had forced her into retirement at 67, telling her she was too old to be relevant, they had inadvertently set her on a path back to her roots and forward to a future she could never have imagined. Outside, the newly installed sign above the expanded bakery caught the last rays of sunlight. Mitchell's 4 Generations of Baking Excellence, Estir 1927, Reborn 2023. Beneath it, a smaller sign announced classes for all ages, from children to seniors, with special workshops on preserving family recipes and techniques. 1 year from her forced retirement, Frances Mitchell stood in her thriving bakery, surrounded by family, students, and community members. What had begun as a last grasp at purpose had evolved into a multi-generational family business and community hub. As she cut the ribbon on their expanded space, now featuring a teaching kitchen where she offered classes to everyone from children to seniors, she realized that her greatest recipe wasn't found in her grandmother's book, but in her own resilience and willingness to begin again when everyone said she was past her prime. She looked at the line of people waiting for the evening's demonstration, faces young and old, familiar and new, all gathered to learn and share and connect through the simple act of baking. Frances rolled up her sleeves, feeling the pleasant ache in her arthritic hands, no longer a reminder of age and limitation, but rather a badge of experience and wisdom worth sharing. "Well," she said to her family with a smile that reached all the way to her eyes, "shall we begin?" Congratulations. Type 9 in the comments so that I know you stayed until the end with me. Thank you for watching, and until tomorrow's story on this same channel.